Horror is probably my favorite genre, if I had to pick one. When done right, it can create some of the most memorable and profound experiences in media. Horror video games in particular can be a little tricky though. There's a lot of them out there that either aren't very good or just aren't very scary. So here I want to highlight some PS5 horror games that are actually scary. Ones that focus on and excel at creating tense atmosphere, instilling real dread, and just scaring the bejesus out of you in one way or another. Visage is perhaps the most pristine example of what PT and Amnesia have contributed to the survival horror genre. It's basically a combination of both, actually. It takes the sanity management of Amnesia and combines it with the eerily familiar hallways and menacing specters of PT. It's a familiar mix that a lot of developers have tried, but only a few have really nailed it, and I think Visage is one of those. It all takes place within this house, and yet the setting feels almost limitless with how each individual chapter expands on it both literally and narratively. You play as Dwayne, who has seemingly offed himself and his entire family, but you're not really sure why. So you walk around and unlock things, read things, listen to tapes, and slowly uncover the truth. This is all while being tormented by other spirits in the house, though, who really create some nerve-wracking moments when they start closing in. You tackle several different chapters in whatever order you want, but the order in which you approach them will impact how they play out, as sometimes you might not have all the items you need to progress, so there's always this underlying theme of exploring the house and investigating every nook and cranny to find key items that are needed to move forward. This is where some tedium might start to set in, but if you take your time and really pay attention to everything, it generally flows pretty well. Plus, Visage always has a way of keeping the player on edge, with ambient sound constantly prickling your ears, with creaks, snaps, pops, and other little noises that are usually benign, but still contribute to some pitch-perfect immersion of walking around in an old, lived-in house that holds more than its share of secrets.
Jesus!
You're also occasionally greeted with more ominous things, like footsteps that sound eerily close by, doors randomly shutting, lights turning off. And while none of this is really new for the genre, the way Visage carries it all out and puts it all together is about as perfect as it can realistically get. You just kind of have to play it to see what I mean. Gripes from me about Visage are pretty minimal, but do include some overly cryptic storytelling that doesn't always make it clear on what to do or what's going on. But like I said, it usually shepherds you along just fine if you're paying attention. I'm not a huge fan of the controls here either. Holding R2 and moving the right stick to open doors is a little bit fiddly, especially when you're in a hurry, and the controls around holding items and storing them in your inventory are pretty awkward. You can just kind of tell that it was designed with mouse and keyboard in mind, not the PS5. But I still prefer horror games in a living room setting, so for me, PS5 it is. Visage looks great, it runs well, and outside of a few slumps here and there, it's an overall outstanding modern horror game. I don't want to spoil it anymore, so I'll just leave it at that. If you haven't played it yet, and you want to see what these modern first-person horror games can really achieve, you should make a beeline for it now. What's old is new with a lot of modern horror games, and nowhere is that more true and done better than games like Tormented Souls, a game that feels ripped right out of 1999 for better and for worse in some ways. Caroline here is investigating the disappearance of a pair of twins that she's become somewhat obsessed with, and wound up unconscious in an overrun hospital. Classic survival horror rules dictate that you start off with basically nothing. No weapons, almost no context, and apparently no clothes. But you do start piecing everything together as the game goes along, including your weapons, which, as you'll quickly discover, are extremely essential. The fixed camera angles and lack of clear direction might take some getting used to, especially if you didn't grow up on PS1 horror games like I did. It does extend a few olive branches to modern players, though. Tormented Souls lets you choose between traditional tank controls or a more modern style. You also don't have any inventory limitations to worry about, at least not that I ran into. The game also runs pretty smoothly, so I suspect most won't have too hard of a time adjusting to this type of gameplay. Sometimes the angle choices can be a bit disorienting, but it's almost as if that's what they were going for. The marauding abominations that patrol the halls and rooms of the hospital are equal parts disturbing and horrifying. Some of them almost start to rival the more unsettling creatures from Silent Hill, which is a compliment I don't make lightly. There's only a small handful of different enemy types, but they hang on to their shock value pretty well, I think. Plus, the limited nature of ammo and health items help keep tension very high. The soundtrack is also great. While pretty minimal, it does draw you in with some ominous industrial overtones and the occasional soft piano fading in and out. It's nothing crazy, they probably could have done a little bit more with it, but it more than gets the job done of propping up the vibe, and that's what matters. Sound effects are also pretty good, with the shotgun in particular sounding really powerful. And the game also teaches you to listen for sounds of movement when you first walk into a room, which is a reflex I haven't tapped into since my days of playing Resident Evil on the PS1. The only thing that gets in the way of Tormented Souls being borderline perfect is the inscrutable puzzles. Now, I'm not much of a puzzle guy myself, so maybe take this criticism with a grain of salt, but from what I can tell in the horror game community, I'm not alone on this. The last thing I want to do when I'm trying to get sucked into a good horror game is have to pull up my phone every 20 minutes and start Googling stuff. They really could have eased off of some of that. It doesn't ruin the game in my opinion, especially if you don't mind glancing at a guide every now and then, but it's worth mentioning in case that's a red line for you. Caroline also loses her mind if she's in the dark for too long, so be prepared to have that lighter out a lot and light candles as you're able to. Obtuse puzzles that I frankly can't believe made it into the game aside, Tormented Souls is overall an outstanding effort from a very small studio. The action is just stilted enough to feel like a classic horror game but still play well. The spooky atmosphere and organic dread it can create are unmatched by most modern horror games out there, and the story actually goes into some interesting directions, especially towards the end. It does a good job of replicating older games, but still doing its own thing, and I really respect that. I also really ended up liking Caroline as a new heroine of survival horror. She almost kind of reminds me of Resident Evil's Jill Valentine or Clock Tower's Jennifer Simpson. She's vulnerable but not totally helpless. She's so obsessed with solving the mystery at hand that it's basically ruined her life, but still, she pursues it. I kind of like that. Hopefully she can become more of a thing.
If I don't find them soon, something terrible might happen.
Okay, so the voice acting might not be winning any awards, but it kind of fits the retro style, so I let it go. Thankfully, the game sold at least well enough because we are supposedly getting a sequel sometime soon. I highly recommend Tormented Souls if you don't mind being stumped from time to time, or occasionally just glancing at a guide. In a way, it sort of gets easier as you get more familiar with the hospital, which thankfully isn't that huge or difficult to memorize. To round out the retro-style horror games I can recommend, I've got to give a mention to Signalus. This isn't technically a PS5 game, so I'm bending the rules a little bit, but it did come out well into the PS5 generation, and it plays just fine on your PS5, so I'm including it. Also, it's my video, I can do what I want, really. What are you gonna do about it? Again, you have a fixed camera perspective, extremely limited resources, and an undeniably unsettling vibe. And it all mixes together pretty nicely here. Signalus mostly takes place in a dark mining facility overrun with monsters who mercilessly attack Elster here on site. Elster is a replica, which is basically an android but with an alarming level of human traits. Kinda like RoboCop, but weirder. At this point in her existence, Elster is struggling with disjointed memories of a lost loved one, on top of the more immediate threat of trying not to die. Signalus mostly plays like the classic survival horror games it's so clearly inspired by, with straightforward shooting, lots of searching for keys, solving puzzles, and managing limited inventory slots. That said, the story and setting are so unique that I don't really want to minimize the game by simply calling it a retro-style horror game. It really has its own feel, and I actually like its desolate techno-horror setting. The story is also a uniquely strange tale that touches on multiple topics, like AI and loneliness, all while leaving several pivotal points of the story completely up for interpretation. The future depicted here is absolutely horrifying in and of itself, and I really hope humanity never ends up in it, but we probably will. Until that happens though, you can enjoy this fictional version of it with Signalus. I really like this game. It has a way of doing a lot with a little by building deep characters and a really interesting world, and yet it manages to avoid coming off as pretentious or overly sophisticated. It's definitely worth playing, and it'll stick in your mind for quite a while. The Resident Evil remakes have been somewhat hit or miss for me, but I've really enjoyed the newer entries. 7 and 8 are two of the greatest horror games ever made in my opinion. Overall, I think 8 might be the more recommendable title of the two though. It continues the story of Ethan Winters and his incredibly unfortunate hands. Ethan is now searching for his daughter in this miserable Romanian village whose regular population has been more or less wiped out and taken over by these 4 insane mutant lords. Pursuing each lord will take Ethan through the 4 main sections of the game, with the more residential part of the village basically serving as a hub world of sorts. Each of the 4 main sections are so well designed and unique that they all feel like they could have just been their own games. And one of them contains what is easily one of the most terrifying levels I've ever played through in a video game. If you somehow haven't had that spoiled for you yet, then you've just gotta see it to believe it. It's honestly amazing how much quality Capcom was able to stuff into this one game. It's definitely got that AAA feel to it, especially if you're playing the PS5 version with improved textures and ray tracing and all that jazz.
Looks like your outside matches your inside.
Also, I gotta give a shout out to the perfect puzzle difficulty here, which is to say that they're pretty easy most of the time and only occasionally venture into being moderately difficult. That's the way I like it, and Resident Evil really seems to understand that puzzles in a horror game should only be there to provide variety, not grind the entire thing to a halt. Truly difficult puzzles should be reserved for actual puzzle games, and I'm fine with dying on that hill.
So now it's time for the beautiful, blood-soaked grand finale.
Resident Evil 8 has got some of the most insane characters, enemies, and level designs the series has ever cooked up. And honestly, it kinda gives me the feeling that maybe Capcom should just start a new series that plays like this and leave the confines of Resident Evil behind. They're basically ignoring most of the lore and the rules that defined the original games here anyway, so maybe it's just time to make it official. So while the game does lose some of the intimate claustrophobic elements that I really liked about 7, and it definitely veers more towards action overall, it still manages to be a profoundly scary game a lot of the time, even when you're walking around outside in broad daylight. This is without a doubt one of the best horror games you can play on your PS5, and honestly, one of the best of all time.
That man will pay for what he's done.
If you're even a casual fan of horror games, then odds are you're already pretty familiar with the Dead Space series, but I can't in good conscience not include it here. The Dead Space series has always been a favorite of mine, and when I heard that they were remaking the original for the PS5, I was pretty much ready to buy it. I would have preferred to see a Dead Space 4, personally, but I'll take what I can get. Dead Space essentially feels like a love child between Resident Evil 4 and Doom 3, and in my opinion, it's actually a lot better than both of those games. Isaac here is trapped in a massive spaceship riddled with monsters after responding to a distress call and winds up at the center of a death cult conspiracy as he searches for his wife among the chaos. It's not a bad story, but the most compelling part is Isaac's personal search for his wife, while his own faculties decline, and it's quite a ride. The game plays a lot like other over-the-shoulder horror games, but with a lot of telekinesis and anti-gravity and other sci-fi stuff thrown in. And it really does a great job of balancing out environmental puzzles that use these different elements with hundreds of encounters with these nightmarish necromorphs, these horrible nightmare monsters that can pop out of just about anywhere. It's very emblematic of 7th gen games too, with a lot of audio logs and holograms driving the story forward, which I think too many games use as a bit of a crutch, but they actually work quite well and make a lot of sense in this setting actually. Dead Space is also pretty action heavy, with puzzles that are rarely difficult and a waypoint tool that makes it basically impossible to ever get lost or turned around. Very nice for dummies like me, although I do wish they just brought in the waypoint system from Dead Space 3 that can direct you to other points of interest. Dead Space on the PS5 isn't afraid to make some changes though, and most of them are for the better. For instance, you can travel back and forth to different areas more freely by calling the train and using it in real time, as opposed to it just being kind of a bookend for the different isolated chapters like in the original game. The boss fights are the highlight of the game for me, but the entire thing is pretty much excellent from start to finish. And the most important thing is, the game is scary. As your arsenal gets deadlier, so do the enemies, so you never get too comfortable. You do end up with plenty of ammo by the end though, so this is actually one of the few games I recommend just playing on hard, for maximum scare factor. While I'm not entirely sure this game needed a full-on remake like this, it is here, and it's awesome. The Fatal Frame games have finally been reintroduced into the horror world, and while I still maintain that the original 3 are the best in the series, Maiden of Blackwater is surprisingly good. It was originally an exclusive for the Wii U, which of course means nobody played it, and also it didn't review that well from what I remember, so I just kinda wrote it off. And never really thought about it again until it got remastered for the PS5, and yeah, this is actually a pretty awesome game. Maiden of Blackwater takes place on the infamous Hikami Mountain, and plays pretty similarly to the earlier games, but with multiple characters, and a bit more emphasis on the combat, with lots of healing items scattered around, and even some RPG elements here and there. You also need to stay dry as much as possible, because being wet will draw more spirits to you and cause you to have to fight more, thus depleting more of your resources, and leaving you less prepared for the bigger fights at the end of levels. Perhaps the biggest difference between this and the older games, though, is the more robust combat, with the camera obscura that can use different types of film with different strengths and upgradable elements. Honestly, I think this is a pretty logical evolution of the Fatal Frame formula. Battling ghosts with camera flashes is strangely satisfying throughout the entire game. It kinda loses a little bit of its scare factor towards the end, in my opinion, but it does stay pretty fun. Something about highlighting several ghosts at once and then getting them all with one big flash feels really gratifying. Almost kinda reminds me of Panzer Dragoon in a weird way. General movement is a bit awkward and wooden, but you get used to it. The very linear nature of the game makes it pretty hard to get lost, and you have fairly clear objectives most of the time, so it shouldn't be a big time sink, unless you're dumber than me, which is highly unlikely. You play several different characters here that all have their own little subplots going on, and none of them are particularly captivating, but they're not bad either. The overall story is the more interesting part, which each chapter chips away at a little bit, and I think it works pretty well and has a pretty good ending. This is not as scary as the original trilogy on the PS2, I really want to underline that, but it definitely has its moments. If the characters were a little bit more interesting, it could have established some real stakes. But as it is, it's a solid horror game that's probably worth whatever reduced price it's going for now. It's also not going to get you hung up on puzzles or confuse you with an overly complex or cryptic story. That is, as long as you don't mind reading most of it. It seems I can't escape the greatness of Namco with any of my videos, so here's another gem from them, Little Nightmares 2. If you've played the first game, then you know exactly what to do here, as it's functionally pretty similar. It's a side-scrolling platformer, essentially, with some environmental puzzles, and also leans into stealth and horror quite a bit. And that combination is what makes these two games extremely unique and recommendable, especially the second one. The enemy designs are so otherworldly and disturbing that I feel equally repulsed and drawn in by them at the same time. I can't stand looking at them, yet I can't look away. It's a very uncomfortable place for your mind to be, and the game almost seems to know that. The dark and brooding world of Little Nightmares is made even more off-putting with the lighting and clever use of shallow depth of field that make it kinda hard for your brain to determine how small or large certain things are. And I gotta say, even though I'm not big on puzzles, this game does them so well that I actually rather enjoy solving them. Everything is laid out really well, and the other character that follows you around gives you subtle hints, so it's unlikely that you'll be really stumped on anything for too long. Some of the enemy encounters do devolve into trial and error a little bit more than I like. More importantly, the game hangs on to its eeriness, even when it's at its slowest, and that's more than I can say for most regular horror games. You don't need to be constantly chased by a horrible monster, or even be aware of any immediate threat to be freaked out. And Little Nightmares 2 completely understands that. That said, when something is actively trying to kill you, the game is as hair-raising as anything else. If you can't already tell, the style of this game is just outstanding. It's gloomy and horrifying, but also kind of cute and endearing, all at the same time. There's really nothing else quite like it. I'm not really sure about a lot of the story or context here, but I also kind of like that. I just enjoy basking in the strangeness of it all. I also really like how the levels have this very clear, invisible fourth wall. It adds a little something to them, and I find that really appealing. Almost kind of reminds me of that game Puppeteer on the PS3 that nobody talks about anymore. Little Nightmares 2, along with everything else I've mentioned, comes highly recommended from me. While I feel like they definitely missed an opportunity to integrate co-op here, there's really nothing to complain about. Excellent horror game here, and very unique. High marks all around. No notes. So there you have it. There's 6 really good horror games that are actually scary that you can play on your PS5, and other stuff too. The big lesson here is that horror games don't need to play any sort of way. They can be very puzzle-oriented, they can be action-oriented, they can even be side-scrolling platformers and still be excellent horror games. So if you like these games, get out there and buy them, especially the ones from small studios, so we can get some more of this type of stuff. And until then, thanks for watching.